Welcome back to Killer Bites, everybody. I'm your host, Zach, and today's case is easily one of my worst nightmares, being kidnapped and held captive in an underground bunker. I know it sounds like this is something that happens very rarely or only in a few horror films, but after some research, it feels like creepy old men holding innocent children in underground bunkers is happening all the time. If you want to learn how a 9-year-old girl outsmarted her captor, I highly suggest you keep watching. The story is terrifying. Catherine Beers was born to her mother Marilyn Beers on December 30th, 1982. Katie's conception was the result of a one-night stand, so she never knew who her biological father was and didn't grow up with a consistent, healthy father figure. Katie had an older half-brother, John, and the two lived with their mother on Long Island, New York. Her upbringing was challenging, to say the very least. Marilyn was a pretty absent mother and rarely spent time with either of her children. It wasn't uncommon for Katie to miss school. Sadly, her teachers never seemed to care that she wasn't in class. Marilyn would drop Katie and John off at her godparents, Linda and Sal Ingaleri's, and they spent most of their time with them. But this new home situation wasn't any better. Sal was physically, emotionally, and sexually abusive to Katie. Just generally an awful man. Here's what Katie had to say.
It was from about maybe 2 years old until about 8 years old that Sal was abusing me. The abuse ranged from verbal and physical to sexual, with him inappropriately touching me, with him making me touch him, or with just complete penetration.
Nearby, a family friend by the name of John Esposito used his opportunity to get close to the kids. He would love bomb them and shower them with gifts and toys, even sexually abusing Katie's brother. What makes this even worse is that in the late 70s, John was arrested for the abduction of a 7-year-old boy from the mall. This case was quickly dropped and John didn't serve any jail time. This didn't seem to deter Marilyn from including John in her children's lives. 14 years later, John decided he would take his child abduction fascination to another level. He would set his sights solely on Katie, planning his next move.
Esposito actually was the first person that ever bought me a bike and tried to teach me how to ride it. He was somebody that I would absolutely have trusted until I didn't.
A couple of days before Katie's 10th birthday, John was spending time with Katie and convinced her he would purchase a birthday gift for her. Instead of going to the mall, however, John drove Katie to his house at 1416 Saxon Avenue in Bay Shore. He let Katie play video games in his bedroom while he prepared for his plan. Here's what Katie said about the incident.
On this day, I felt very uncomfortable being in his house by myself, being up in his bedroom, sitting on his bed. He sat on the bed behind me and he put his hand over my mouth, told me that he wasn't gonna hurt me, and then pulled me onto his lap. At that point, he then sexually assaulted me while I was sitting on his lap. And he continued to tell me that he wasn't gonna hurt me. So he picked me up and had me underneath his one arm, like by my hip. So I was like laying down and kicking and flailing and crying and screaming. And he carried me into his office and he threw me underneath his desk.
Unbeknownst to anyone, John Esposito had successfully dug a tunnel underground leading to below his garage. There, you would find a concrete bunker trapped behind a large concrete door. Inside, a 6-foot by 7-foot hidden room lay, with an even smaller box-like room with a television, toilet, and a small bed, where Katie was forced to spend most of her captivity. The door leading to the tunnel was hidden behind a secret bookshelf in his room.
The closet that was in his office had an unfinished wall, so there were just nails sticking out from the drywall, and I remember my back piercing them. So now I'm crying because I'm scared. I'm convulsing because I'm hurt. I see that he is maneuvering something from the floor. And then suddenly this huge slab of concrete that is very, very thick rises up from the floor and it opens up this big hole. He then tells me to get in there and I tell him no. I'm sure he had to tell me several times before he just reached over it, picked me up, and basically just dropped me down into this hole. But he then maneuvers himself around me, in front of me, and he pushes open this door and it opens up into this room that is somewhere on his property.
If that wasn't enough, John bound her with chains and watched her from cameras he had set up. A few years prior, Katie remembered playing in the dirt mounds that John had used to build the tunnels and the bunker. She never knew what he was building. Little did she know, he was designing it specifically for her. So creepy. John had planned slightly ahead, knowing that he needed Katie's disappearance to look as seamless as possible without implicating himself, or at least trying not to implicate himself. He forced Katie to record a voice message to her family based on a script he had written. She stated that a knife-wielding man had taken her and used her real fear against her. John assumed that this message was flawless. Soon after, he locked Katie away and drove to an arcade in Suffolk County and played the recording into a payphone. After this, he ran into the arcade, playing up his terror, explaining that he had lost Katie somewhere inside the building. No one remembered seeing Katie, but they do recall John's frantic behavior. After searching for a child that wasn't there, the police department was called and a missing persons report was filed and released. For the next 2 weeks, 43-year-old John took advantage of 10-year-old Katie, sexually abusing her whenever he wanted. He would unlock her from the small box and allow her into the larger part of the bunker, but after he was finished, he locked her back inside the box. John would give Katie junk food and toys when he wasn't violently abusing her, I assume as a way to butter her up. This method didn't work, and obviously Katie didn't trust him as far as she could throw him. He even admitted that his plan was to keep her trapped in the bunker for the rest of her life. What makes this even more terrifying, Katie said her abusive upbringing allowed her to survive. She was used to violent treatment mixed with neglect, and this situation was exactly that.
The total amount of time that I was abducted for was 17 days. Time basically stood still. I had no natural sunlight. My sleep schedule was completely off. I never wanted to go to sleep because from the very beginning, Esposito saying, I want to take a picture of you looking like you're dead so I could send it to the police. Esposito spent a decent amount of time down in the dungeon with me. As the police presence at his house became more prevalent and they knew he had me, but they didn't know where.
Katie's only access to the world was the television John allowed in the room. Obviously, she was watching the news and kept getting updates on the search. Knowledge is power, and Katie started using the broadcasts to craft her escape. All she would do was watch the TV, hoping they were still covering her story. Thankfully, they were. Katie had said that if she stopped hearing her name in the news, she would have given up hope and accepted her new fate. At one point, John wanted the search to stop. He came down to the bunker and planned to take photos of Katie with her eyes closed. He would release these pictures and the search would stop, as the public would believe she was dead. Katie used her quick thinking anytime food was placed in front of her. She knew that John could have easily tampered it with sleeping pills. The second she fell asleep, he would take the pictures and the search would stop. Katie was always on high alert around John, literally keeping one eye open all the time. This prevented the photos from ever being captured. While all of this was going on, the search for Katie was out in full force, and John was almost immediately identified as a suspect. For starters, John was a known family friend. On top of that, he had a history of child abduction. Then, the voice recording from the phone booth was entirely too clean, with no other noise in the background. It was clearly a setup. Lastly, Katie's brother came forward with stories of his own sexual abuse from John. Investigators wanted to be sure. They sat outside his house, staking out the home for days, watching his routine, and eventually, they would close in. Katie started to slowly use her tips from the news as a way to scare John. She started talking about possibilities far into the future that John hadn't given much thought to. For example, how would she go to school? Well, he would homeschool her. How would she work and make money? Oh, he had enough money for the both of them. When would she get married or have children? John would marry her when she was 18 and get her pregnant. But the reality of these situations started to close in on him. What would really happen 2 years from now? 5 years? 10 years? Could he really keep this up? The paranoia of getting caught ate away at him morning and night. Sadly, this did not turn into guilt. He felt far more concerned with what would happen to him if he were caught than the conditions in which he was forcing Katie to live. On January 13th, 1993, the pressure finally got to John. It was too much to live with. He had become painfully aware of the cars stalking his movement, the questions Katie would ask, and at that point, he knew it was over. He confessed to the police at the station and led them to his house. There, they found the underground tunnel, the concrete-encased bunker. 10-year-old Katie was finally released from her tiny cell after being held captive for 17 days. When they arrived, The police planned on seeing a dead body. Instead, they found a bubbly, excited kid waiting to be rescued. They could tell she knew that the worst was behind her. She had nothing to worry about anymore. She'd been saved. Her hope wasn't for nothing. After pleading guilty to kidnapping, John was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. He had a total of 10 charges running against him, including sexual abuse and endangering the life of a child. Somehow, he wasn't charged with rape, even though Katie was very forward about her experiences. In the end, he accepted a plea deal, and these charges were dropped. While all of this was going on, Katie was incredibly upfront about her horrible abuse at the hands of Sal Inghilleri. She was taking everybody down, and rightfully so. He didn't get off scot-free and was sentenced to 12 years in prison for molestation, finally brought to justice for the years of abuse prior to Katie's kidnapping. But what happened to Katie? There's no way they would put her back in the hands of her absent mother who allowed these adults around her kids. Instead, Katie was introduced into the foster system. They lived in East Hampton, New York, where she lived until she reached adulthood. This new family was awesome and nowhere near the environment she endured before. She felt like she belonged somewhere. She was allowed to be a kid, run around and play. She could finally breathe for the first time in years. In 2009, Sal Inghilleri died in his prison cell, still serving his sentence. 4 years later, after his fourth parole hearing, John Esposito was found dead in his prison cell. He passed from natural causes. Unfortunately, he was never charged with the rape of a minor before he died. Now, Katie lives with her husband and 2 children in a small area of Pennsylvania where she works in insurance. It's a simple, calm life, the one she always deserved growing up. The same year John Esposito died, Katie released her memoir detailing her horrific upbringing, the abuse, and the kidnapping. Katie also spends time as a motivational speaker, traveling around and sharing her story with crowds across the country. She notes that while she experienced some awful trauma, she was determined to leave that in her past. She doesn't take any of that into her own adulthood and treats her children with kindness and respect. She says, "My life is exactly what I had always wanted. I have 2 parents who love me, a husband and 2 kids, and a wonderful family. I think the best part of my story is knowing you can recover and you can persevere, and your life is 100% what you make it to be." It's such a relief to hear that Katie is living her best life with a beautiful family. She can start over and move forward. You are truly an inspiration, Katie. And that, my viewers, is the end of today's case. This one is wild. I can't imagine going through something as traumatic as this and making it out alive, let alone not being completely ruined mentally. I would really love to hear all of your thoughts on this case. Have you heard of Katie's story before? I know of some similar stories, some with less happy endings, so it's nice to hear about some hope on this show. I'll catch you all in the next episode. I'm your host, Zach. Stay safe out there, everyone. Bye.